The conference room fell silent as Emma Reid clicked to her final slide. 27 floors above downtown Denver, the glass walls offered a panoramic view of the Rocky Mountains, their peaks dusted with early October snow. She'd spent 3 months perfecting this presentation, the Morrison Cultural Center, a project that would establish her firm as a leader in sustainable architecture. Questions. Emma's voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd fought for every achievement. The clients exchanged glances. The Morrison Development Group had flown in from Montana specifically for this meeting. Emma watched their faces, reading the subtle signs of approval she'd learned to recognize over 8 years of building her career from nothing. Her phone buzzed against the table. Then again, Emma ignored it, maintaining eye contact with the lead investor. Professional courtesy demanded her full attention, even as the persistent vibration gnawed at her concentration. "Miss Reid, this is impressive work." The older man leaned forward. "However, we'll need to discuss." Emma's phone erupted in a shrill ring. She glanced down, seeing her mother's contact photo. Catherine Reid never called during business hours. Never. "I apologize. Please excuse me for just one moment." Emma stepped toward the window, accepting the call with trembling fingers. "Emma, honey." Her mother's voice carried a thickness that made Emma's chest tighten. "You need to come home. It's Grandma Margaret." The words that followed seemed to come from underwater. Heart attack. Paramedics. Too late. Through the glass, the mountains blurred as Emma's eyes filled with tears she couldn't afford to shed. "Not here. Not now." "She kept asking for you at the end," Catherine whispered. "And she said a name. Jake. She kept saying, 'Tell Jake.' I don't understand." The phone slipped from Emma's numb fingers, clattering against the floor. 27 floors below Denver continued its relentless pace, unaware that Emma Reid's carefully constructed world had just shattered. Behind her, the Morrison Development Group waited in polite silence. Their project could wait. Everything could wait. Grandma Margaret was gone. And somehow, even in death, Jake Morrison had found a way back into Emma's life. The drive from Denver to Millbrook took 6 hours through winding mountain roads that Emma had once known by heart. Now returning after 10 years, the familiar landmarks felt like ghosts of someone else's memories. The billboard for Morrison Ranch still dominated the valley entrance, though the paint had faded and the wood showed signs of weather damage. Millbrook hadn't grown much. Main Street stretched for exactly 12 blocks, bookended by the Methodist Church on one end and Reid's Family Diner on the other. Emma parked outside the diner, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. The building looked smaller than as she remembered. The red brick needed repointing and the vintage sign hung slightly crooked, but the large windows still offered a view into the warm interior where her grandmother had served coffee and home-cooked meals to 3 generations of Millbrook residents. A piece of paper was taped to the front door. Emma approached slowly, dreading what she might find. "Closed until further notice due to family emergency. Thank you for your understanding. Margaret Reid." The handwriting was shaky, uncertain. Not like Grandma Margaret at all. "Emma." She turned to find a woman approaching from across the street. Blonde hair, kind eyes, wearing a teacher's practical cardigan despite the autumn chill. It took Emma a moment to recognize her. "Sarah Mitchell." Emma managed a smile. "I'm sorry, Sarah Peterson now." "Still Mitchell. Decided to keep my name when I got married. Old habits." Sarah's smile was warm but cautious. "I'm so sorry about Margaret. She was special to all of us." Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. The condolences would come in waves, she knew. In a town of 800 people, everyone had been touched by Margaret Reid's kindness. "I heard you're an architect now, in Denver." Sarah shifted her weight, the awkwardness of a decade apart settling between them. "Yes, I have my own firm." The words felt hollow. Success in the outside world seemed irrelevant here, where progress was measured in generations rather than quarterly reports. "That's wonderful. We could use an architect here, actually. The school board is, well, that's not important right now." Sarah glanced toward the diner. "Do you know how long you'll be staying?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer. Emma's life was in Denver. Her clients, her apartment, her carefully ordered existence. But standing here on Main Street, breathing the thin mountain air that tasted of pine and wood smoke, she felt an unexpected pull. "I'm not sure. There are arrangements to make. Legal things." Emma pulled her jacket tighter. The October air carried a bite that city living had made her forget. 6 months, maybe. The lawyer mentioned something about residency requirements. Sarah's eyebrows rose. 6 months? That's, that's significant time. Before Emma could respond, a familiar rumble filled the air. A black pickup truck rounded the corner, slowing as it approached the diner. Through the windshield, Emma caught a glimpse of the driver, broad shoulders, dark hair beneath a worn baseball cap, hands gripping the steering wheel with the easy confidence of someone who belonged here. Jake Morrison. Even after 10 years, recognition hit her like a physical blow. He looked older, more solid, but the basic geometry of him remained unchanged. The truck continued past without stopping, but not before Emma saw him glance in her direction. Their eyes met for perhaps half a second. In that brief moment, she saw surprise flicker across his features before the truck disappeared around the next corner. "I should let you get settled," Sarah said gently. "But Emma, I'm glad you're home. Margaret would be too." Home. The word sat strangely in Emma's mind as Sarah walked away. Millbrook had never felt like home exactly. It had been a place to escape from, a reminder of everything she wasn't sophisticated enough, successful enough, good enough to claim as hers. But standing here now with the diner key heavy in her palm and the scent of autumn leaves swirling around her, Emma wondered if she'd been wrong about a lot of things. The inside of Reid's family diner looked frozen in time. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, their surfaces cracked but clean. The black and white checkered floors showed decades of wear in a path from the front door to the counter. Behind the register, a corkboard displayed business cards, thank you notes, and photos spanning 40 years of community life. Emma found herself drawn to the photos. Her grandmother with various customers celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, graduations. In the center, a photo she'd never seen before, Margaret Reid shaking hands with a much younger Tom Morrison at some kind of ribbon-cutting ceremony. Both were smiling, but something in their posture suggested formality rather than friendship. The kitchen smelled of coffee and cinnamon scents that transported Emma instantly to childhood, afternoons spent doing homework at the counter, while Margaret prepared the dinner rush. She opened the industrial refrigerator, finding it mostly empty except for the basics. Her grandmother had been preparing to close even before. Emma's throat tightened. Margaret had known she was dying. The close sign, the cleaned-out inventory, the legal documents her lawyer had mentioned, all evidence of a woman making final arrangements. A soft knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Through the glass, she could see a figure silhouetted against the street lamp. Tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakably male. Emma's pulse quickened as she approached the door. The motion sensor light flickered on, illuminating Jake Morrison's face. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking as uncertain as she'd ever seen him. For a long moment, they stared at each other through the glass. 10 years collapsed into nothing. She was 17 again, standing in the same spot, watching him drive away for what she'd thought would be the last time. Emma unlocked the door but kept the chain latch engaged, opening it just enough to speak. "Jake." "Emma." His voice was deeper than she remembered, roughened by time and experience. "I heard you were back." "News travels fast." "It's Millbrook." "News travels at the speed of light." A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "I wanted to. I'm sorry about Margaret. She was a good woman." Emma studied his face, looking for signs of the femme who had once made her life miserable. The sharp edges had softened, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of weather and worry. But the fundamental Jake-ness remained, the intensity, the way he seemed to take up more space than his physical form required. "Thank you." She paused, uncertain how much conversation this moment could bear. "How are you?" He seemed to consider the question seriously. "Different." "You had different too." They stood in awkward silence, the weight of shared history pressing between them. Emma found herself cataloging the changes, the scar along his left temple, the calloused hands that suggested manual labor, the way he held himself with less of the easy arrogance. She remembered. "I should let you get back to—" Jake gestured vaguely toward the diner's interior. "Yes, there's a lot to sort through." He nodded, started to turn away, then stopped. "Emma, your grandmother, she was kind to me after you left. I thought you should know that." Before Emma could ask what he meant, Jake Morrison disappeared into the Montana darkness, leaving only the scent of pine and the echo of words that raised more questions than they answered. Emma spent the next 3 days sorting through a lifetime of accumulated memories. Margaret Reid had been a saver. Every newspaper clipping, every thank you note, every photograph had been carefully preserved in boxes that now covered every surface of the diner's back office. The legal requirements were more complex than she'd anticipated. Montana law required a 6-month residency period before she could finalize the estate transfer. 6 months in Millbrook managing a business she'd never wanted in a town she'd spent her adult life avoiding. Her mother had been less than supportive during their nightly phone calls. 6 months, Emma. What about your firm? What about the Morrison Project? The irony wasn't lost on Emma that the Morrison Cultural Center, her potential career breakthrough, shared a name with the family that had dominated Millbrook for 3 generations. She'd avoided mentioning this coincidence to her mother, who still spoke of the Morrisons with barely concealed resentment. I can work remotely. Video conferences, electronic file transfers. It's 2024, Mom, not 1994. It's not about the technology, honey. It's about what that place does to you, to us. We left for good reasons. Emma understood her mother's concerns, but something had shifted during these quiet days in the diner. Maybe it was grief, or maybe it was the strange peace that came from being somewhere she could breathe without the constant pressure to prove herself. Denver had been a ladder to climb. Millbrook just was. On the 4th morning, she decided to open the diner for business. The decision surprised her. She had no restaurant experience beyond childhood observation, no real plan beyond making coffee and serving the simple breakfast items she'd found in the freezer. But the building felt wrong when it was empty, like a heart that had stopped beating. The first customer arrived at 6:30 a.m., just as Emma was figuring out how to operate the ancient cash register. Coffee black, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast. The man was perhaps 60, weathered by years of outdoor work, speaking with the economy of someone accustomed to being understood without explanation. Emma stared at him, panic rising in her throat. This isn't really. You're Margaret's granddaughter, the architect from Denver. It wasn't a question. I'm Bill Watson. I've been coming here every morning for 15 years. Margaret always had my order ready before I sat down. The weight of expectations settled on Emma's shoulders. She could explain that she wasn't qualified, that she'd never worked in food service, that this was all a temporary arrangement. Or she could try. Coffee black, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast. Emma repeated the order, committing it to memory. Coming right up. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of coffee refills, scrambled eggs, and increasingly confident navigation of Margaret's kitchen systems. The breakfast rush brought 12 customers, all locals, all polite, curious about the woman who had inherited Reid's family diner. By 9 a.m., Emma was exhausted but oddly exhilarated. She'd successfully fed a dozen people without poisoning anyone or burning down the building. Small victories. She was cleaning the grill when the bell above the front door chimed again. Emma looked up to find Jake Morrison sliding into the corner booth, the same spot where he'd sat during high school when he'd come in with his friends to nurse coffee and plot whatever adventures occupied teenage boys. Their eyes met across the diner. This time, neither looked away. Coffee, Emma called out, her voice steadier than she felt. Please. She poured a cup from the pot she'd learned to keep fresh throughout the morning, walking over to his table with what she hoped looked like casual confidence. Up close, she could see that the years had been kind to Jake Morrison. The boy she'd known had been handsome in an obvious way, all sharp cheekbones and easy smiles. The man sitting before her had grown into his features, gaining a depth that made her oddly aware of her own heartbeat. How's the transition going? He asked as she set down the coffee. Harder than I expected, easier than I feared. Emma found herself sitting across from him before she could think better of it. I never realized how much skill goes into something that looks simple. Margaret made it look effortless, but she'd been doing this for 40 years. 38, Emma corrected automatically, then felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd always been competitive with Jake, even about things that didn't matter. His smile was gentle rather than mocking. 38 then, still a long time to perfect anything. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Outside Main Street was waking up to another ordinary day. A few cars passed their occupants, craning their necks to peer through the diner windows. By noon, everyone in Millbrook would know that Emma Reid and Jake Morrison had been seen having coffee together. Can I ask you something? Emma heard herself say. Shoot. Why did my grandmother mention your name when she was... Emma's voice caught. My mother said she kept asking for you. Jake's expression grew serious. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, staring into the dark liquid as if it might contain answers. We talk sometimes. After you left for college, she worried about you, whether you were eating enough, whether you were happy, whether you'd ever come back. And what did you tell her? That you were exactly where you needed to be, that you were building something important. Jake met her eyes. That Millbrook was lucky to have produced someone like you, even if we weren't smart enough to keep you. The words hit Emma like a physical blow. This wasn't the Jake Morrison. She remembered the boy who had represented everything she'd felt excluded from in Millbrook. This was someone who spoke with careful consideration, who seemed to understand the weight words could carry. I don't understand, she said quietly. Understand what why you're being. Emma struggled for the right word. Kind. Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a sadness that seemed too deep for someone only 29 years old. Because I wish I'd been kind 10 years ago. Because your grandmother helped me understand what I'd lost when you left. Because some mistakes take years to recognize and even longer to try to fix. Before Emma could respond, the front door chimed again. A woman in an expensive coat entered, her gaze sharp and assessing as it moved between Emma and Jake. Even without introduction, Emma recognized the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Jacob? The woman's voice carried clear disapproval. Your father is looking for you. Jake's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. Mother, I was just having coffee with Miss Reid. Yes, I can see that. The woman turned to Emma with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You must be Margaret's granddaughter. I'm Martha Morrison. I was very sorry to hear about your loss. Thank you. Emma stood suddenly, feeling underdressed in her coffee-stained apron. Mrs. Morrison, I understand you'll be staying in Millbrook for several months. How interesting. I'm sure you'll find our little town quite different from city life. The words were polite, but the subtext was clear. You don't belong here. Emma felt the familiar stirring of defiance that had gotten her into trouble so many times during adolescence. Actually, I'm finding it quite peaceful. It's nice to be somewhere people care about each other. Martha Morrison's smile sharpened. Indeed, we're very protective of our community here. Very careful about changes that might disrupt the balance we've worked so hard to maintain. Jake stood abruptly. I should go. Emma, thank you for the coffee. As he moved toward the door, he paused beside his mother. I'll be along shortly. See that you are. The Patterson meeting is at 11. They left together, but not before Emma caught the tension in Jake's posture, the way he seemed to shrink slightly in his mother's presence. Whatever confidence he'd shown during their conversation evaporated the moment family duty called. Emma cleared the coffee cups with more force than necessary, her mind churning. Some things in Millbrook hadn't changed at all. The Morrisons still controlled the town with subtle but unmistakable authority, and outsiders were still made to feel their place. But as she wiped down the table where Jake had sat, Emma found herself thinking about the sadness in his voice, the careful weight of his words. 10 years ago, she would have dismissed any gesture from Jake Morrison as manipulation or mockery. Now she wasn't so sure, and that uncertainty scared her more than any amount of Morrison family disapproval. The afternoon brought a different rhythm to the diner. The lunch crowd was smaller but more diverse. A few tourists heading toward Glacier National Park, some locals grabbing quick meals between errands, and a steady stream of coffee drinkers who seemed more interested in conversation than caffeine. Emma began to understand the diner's role as the town's informal gathering place. News was shared, opinions were debated, and social connections were maintained over bottomless cups of coffee and slices of Margaret's famous apple pie, which Emma had been relieved to find in the freezer. Around 3 p.m., Sarah Mitchell arrived with a stack of papers under her arm and worry lines creasing her forehead. Mind if I spread out for a bit? Sarah asked, gesturing toward the papers. I need to finish these grant applications, and the school is too depressing right now. Of course. Coffee. Please, and one of those pie slices if you don't mind. I've been stress eating since September. Emma served the pie and settled across from Sarah, grateful for the company. Grant applications. Trying to save the elementary school, the state wants to consolidate with the district 30 miles east. Bus the kids an hour each way, kill another piece of what makes Millbrook viable for young families. Sarah's voice carried the frustration of someone fighting a battle she couldn't win. These grants are our last hope, but the applications require architectural assessments, cost projections, renovation timelines, things I have no idea how to provide. Emma found herself leaning forward, professionally interested despite herself. What kind of structural issues are we talking about? Everything. The roof leaks, the foundation has settling problems, the electrical system is probably a fire hazard. The building is 80 years old and hasn't been properly maintained in at least 20. Sarah pushed the papers toward Emma. Want to see the disaster? The photographs were worse than Emma had expected. Water damage had warped floors and created dangerous mold situations. Outdated electrical panels posed genuine safety risks. The heating system looked like it belonged in a museum. But beneath the neglect, Emma could see good bones. Solid construction, high ceilings, beautiful natural light from large windows. The kind of building that could be spectacular with the right intervention. How much time do you have? Emma asked. The applications are due in 2 weeks. The state review process takes 6 months. If we're approved, we'd have a year to complete the renovations before they make the consolidation decision final. Emma's mind was already working, seeing possibilities. Sustainable upgrades that would reduce long-term operating costs. Historical preservation that could qualify for additional funding streams. Smart design solutions that could transform a failing building into a model for rural education. I could help, she heard herself saying, with the architectural assessment at least. Maybe some preliminary design concepts. Sarah's face lit up. Really, you'd do that? I'd need to see the building in person, review the engineering reports, understand the budget constraints. Emma felt the familiar excitement of a challenging project beginning to take shape. But yes, I think I could help. Emma, you might just save our school and our town. The weight of that responsibility settled over Emma like a warm blanket. In Denver, her projects were about profit margins and aesthetic statements. Here, architecture could mean the difference between a community's survival and slow death. They spent the next hour reviewing documents and discussing possibilities. Emma found herself energized in a way she hadn't felt in months. This wasn't about impressing clients or building her reputation. This was about using her skills for something that mattered to real people. The front door chimed, and Emma looked up to see Jake Morrison entering again. This time he moved with less certainty, glancing around as if ensuring they were alone. Sarah, Emma, he nodded to each of them. I don't mean to interrupt. Not interrupting, Sarah said, gathering her papers. I was just leaving. Emma, think about what we discussed. I will. I'll drive by the school tomorrow morning. After Sarah left, Jake slid into the booth again. The late afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. School trouble, he asked. Potentially. Sarah's trying to keep it from being shut down. Emma refilled his coffee cup without being asked. I might help with the grant applications. That's good of you. Something in his tone made Emma look at him more carefully. You don't sound convinced. Jake was quiet for a moment, turning the coffee cup in his hands. The school's situation is more complicated than Sarah probably told you. How so? The consolidation isn't just a state efficiency measure. There are people here who support it. People who think Millbrook needs to accept reality and stop fighting economic inevitability. People like your family, Jake's smile was rueful. People exactly like my family. My father sits on the school board. He's been pushing for consolidation for 2 years. Emma felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. Of course the Morrisons would be involved. Of course they would choose profit over community, efficiency over the messy human connections that made places worth preserving. And you, she asked, what do you think? Jake paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I think some fights are worth having, even if you can't win them. That's not an answer. Yes, it is. It's just not the answer you expected. They stared at each other across the small table. Emma found herself noticing details she'd missed before, the way Jake's hands showed signs of manual labor, despite his family's wealth. The fact that his clothes were practical rather than fashionable. The sense that he was carrying burdens that had nothing to do with ranch management or family expectations. Jake. Emma's voice was softer than she'd intended. What happened to you? To you? Ahamako. The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, his careful composure slipped, and Emma saw something raw and unguarded in his expression. Life, he said finally. Same thing that happened to you, I suspect. We grew up. But even as he said it, Emma knew there was more to the story. Jake Morrison had changed in ways that went deeper than simple maturation. The boy she'd known had been confident to the point of arrogance, secure in his place at the top of Millbrook's social hierarchy. The man sitting across from her seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. And despite everything, their complicated history, her mother's warnings, her own hard-won independence, Emma found herself wanting to understand what had put that sadness in his eyes. Outside, the October sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Soon the dinner crowd would arrive, and Emma would need to figure out how to manage the evening rush without burning down Margaret's legacy. But for now, she sat in comfortable silence with Jake Morrison, watching the light fade over Millbrook, and wondering if coming home had been a mistake or the best decision she'd never planned to make. The Millbrook Elementary School sat on the edge of town like a forgotten promise. Emma pulled her rental car into the empty parking lot, studying the brick building through her windshield. Even from a distance, she could see the problems Sarah had described. Sagging roof lines, boarded windows, foundation cracks that spoke of decades of deferred maintenance. But she could also see potential. The morning air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter as Emma walked the building's perimeter, taking notes and photos. The architectural bones were solid 1940s construction with thick walls and high ceilings that modern builders would envy. The problems were surface level, expensive, but not insurmountable. Assessing the damage, Emma turned to find Jake approaching from across the street. He moved with the easy gait of someone comfortable in his own skin, but she noticed he kept his hands buried in his jacket pockets. Something like that, Emma gestured toward the building. It's not as bad as I expected. That's encouraging. Sarah's been fighting this battle for 2 years. She deserves some good news. They stood side by side, studying the school in companionable silence. Emma found herself acutely aware of Jake's presence, the warmth radiating from his body in the cold air, the subtle scent of pine and leather that seemed to follow him everywhere. Can I ask you something? Emma said. Shoot. Yesterday you said some fights are worth having, even if you can't win them. Did you mean the school? Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Emma look at him more carefully. I meant everything. The school, this town, the idea that some things matter more than profit margins. He paused. People like us, we don't get to choose our battles. They choose us. People like us. People who love places that don't love them back. The words hung in the cold air between them. Emma felt something shift in her chest, a recognition she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Jake, there you are. They turned to see a black SUV pulling into the parking lot. Tom Morrison emerged from the driver's side, his expensive coat and polished boots incongruous against the rural setting. Even at 65, he commanded attention, tall, silver-haired, moving with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Dad? Jake's posture changed subtly, shoulders straightening in a way that suggested long-practiced defense. Jacob, Miss Reid. Tom's acknowledgement of Emma was polite but cool. Interesting place for a morning stroll. I asked Emma to look at the building, Jake said. Get a professional opinion on the renovation costs. Tom's smile never wavered, but Emma caught the flash of displeasure in his eyes. How thoughtful, though I'm afraid any assessment would be purely academic at this point. The board voted last night to accept the state's consolidation proposal. Emma felt Sarah's dreams crumble in real time. I'm sorry, voted. I thought the applications weren't due for 2 weeks. Emergency session. We received new information about the district's financial situation. Delaying the inevitable would only cost taxpayers more money. Tom's voice carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to explaining difficult decisions to simple people. What kind of new information? Jake's question was sharp enough to make his father's eyes narrow. Budget projections, enrollment trends, the kind of data that responsible leadership requires. Tom stepped closer to his son. The kind of decisions you'll need to understand when you take over the ranch operations. Emma watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about a school closing. This was about power inheritance and the careful choreography of small-town politics. I should go, she said quietly. Actually, Tom said, perhaps you could walk with us, Miss Reid. I'd be interested in your professional opinion about another development project. Before Emma could decline, Tom was already moving toward his SUV. Jake fell into step beside her, his expression unreadable. You don't have to do this, he murmured. Do what? Whatever my father is planning. But Emma found herself curious despite her better judgment. The Morrison family had shaped Millbrook for 3 generations. Understanding their vision for the town's future might help her understand why her grandmother had mentioned Jake's name in her final moments. The drive took them along the valley road toward the mountains. Emma had forgotten how beautiful this country could be, rolling hills dotted with cattle stands of aspen already turning gold, the jagged peaks of the Rockies rising like cathedral spires against the autumn sky. Tom Morrison proved to be an engaging tour guide, pointing out family holdings and local landmarks with the pride of someone whose roots ran deep. But Emma noticed that Jake remained silent throughout the drive, staring out the window, with the expression of someone seeing familiar territory through strangers' eyes. They stopped at a scenic overlook where a wooden sign marked the entrance to Morrison Ranch. Below them, the valley spread out in a patchwork of fields and pastures bisected by a silver thread of river. Beautiful, isn't it? Tom said. My great-grandfather chose this spot in 1892. 4 generations of Morrisons have worked this land. It's stunning, Emma admitted. And it was the kind of landscape that made her understand why people fought wars over territory. The ranch is 12,000 acres now. Cattle, some farming, a little hunting and fishing for tourists. But the real value, Tom gestured toward the mountains, the real value is in the potential. He unrolled a set of architectural plans on the hood of the SUV. Emma found herself looking at a massive development proposal luxury resort golf course, residential lots scattered across what was currently pristine rangeland. Morrison Mountain Resort, Tom said. 300 units, championship golf course, spa facilities, conference center. A destination that would put Millbrook on the map. Emma studied the plans with professional interest. The design was competent but uninspired, the kind of generic luxury development that could exist anywhere in the American West. Beautiful in its way, but completely disconnected from the landscape it would occupy. Who's the architect? She asked. Morrison Development Group handles all our projects in-house, but we're always interested in fresh perspectives. Tom's smile was calculating, especially from someone with your reputation. Emma glanced at Jake, who was still staring at the valley with unreadable intensity. My reputation? The Morrison Cultural Center in Denver. We've been following your work with great interest. The coincidence finally made sense. The Morrison Development Group that had flown to Denver for her presentation wasn't just any client, they were Jake's family. Her potential career breakthrough was tied directly to the people who had made her childhood miserable. I see, Emma said carefully. The resort project could use someone with your vision, someone who understands how to blend development with environmental sensitivity. Tom rolled up the plans. Think about it, Miss Reid. This could be mutually beneficial. As they drove back toward town, Emma found herself processing the morning's revelations. The school closure, the resort development, her grandmother's mysterious final words. Everything felt connected in ways she couldn't quite grasp. You're quiet, Jake said as they approached Main Street. Just thinking. About the resort. Emma looked at him carefully. Among other things. Your father seems to think I'd be interested in the project. Are you? It was a simple question with a complicated answer. Professionally, the Morrison Mountain Resort represented exactly the kind of high-profile commission that could establish her firm as a major player in luxury development. The money would be substantial, the exposure invaluable. But sitting in the back seat of Tom Morrison's SUV, looking at plans that would forever change the landscape her grandmother had loved, Emma felt sick to her stomach. I don't know, she said honestly. Jake nodded as if he'd expected that answer. For what it's worth, I hope you'll think carefully before deciding. Why? Because some things, when once they're gone, don't come back. That evening, Emma found herself alone in the diner, surrounded by Margaret's photo albums and trying to make sense of her conflicted feelings. The dinner rush had been busier than expected. Word was spreading that Reid's family diner was open again, and people seemed genuinely happy to have the gathering place restored. But the joy felt fragile, overshadowed by the morning's news about the school closure and the looming threat of resort development. Emma was beginning to understand that Millbrook stood at a crossroads, and the decisions made in the next few months would determine whether the town survived as a community or transformed into something else entirely. A soft knock at the front door interrupted her brooding. Through the glass, she could see Sarah Mitchell holding a bottle of wine and wearing the determined expression of someone who'd had a very long day. Emma unlocked the door. I heard about the school board meeting. Emergency session, my ass. Sarah swept into the diner, setting the wine on the nearest table. Tom Morrison has been planning this for months. The new financial information was a consultant's report he commissioned himself. That's not legal, is it? It's not illegal, just ethically questionable, which is par for the course with the Morrison family. Sarah collapsed into a booth. God, I need a drink, and probably a new job. Emma fetched glasses from behind the counter, settling across from Sarah as she opened the wine. What will you do now? Fight it. Appeal to the state organized. Parents make Tom Morrison's life as difficult as possible. Sarah's smile was grim. I'm very good at being a pain in the ass when the situation calls for it. Can I help with being a pain in the ass? Absolutely. Though I should warn you, taking on the Morrison family isn't for the faint of heart. Emma sipped her wine, thinking about Tom Morrison's calculated smile and Jake's careful silences. What's their story really? I know they're powerful, but there has to be more to it. Sarah was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much truth Emma could handle. The Morrison family basically owns this valley. They control the bank, half the town council, and most of the major employers. When they want something to happen, it happens. When they want something stopped, it stops. Sarah paused. But they're not cartoon villains, Emma. They genuinely believe they're doing what's best for Millbrook. And Jake, where does he fit in all this? That's complicated. Sarah responded, filled their glasses. Jake was supposed to be the heir apparent, go to college, learn the business, come back and take over the family empire. Everything was planned out from the time he could walk. What happened? Life happened. He went to Montana State for 2 years, then suddenly enlisted in the Army. Spent 4 years overseas, most of it in Afghanistan. Came back, different. Emma thought about the sadness she'd glimpsed in Jake's eyes, the way he'd seemed to carry invisible burdens. Different how? Quieter, more serious, less willing to go along with his father's plans without question. Sarah's voice softened, and haunted in a way that breaks your heart if you pay attention. They sat in comfortable silence, processing the weight of small-town complications. Outside Main Street was settling into evening quiet, the kind of peaceful scene that tourism brochures love to promote. Sarah, Emma said, can I ask you something personal? Shoot. Do you think I'm making a mistake? Staying here, I mean. Getting involved in all this? Sarah studied Emma's face with the careful attention of someone who'd spent years reading the emotions of children and confused adults. I think, she said slowly, that some mistakes are worth making. And I think your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing when she structured that will the way she did. Before Emma could ask what she meant, the front door opened again. This time it was Jake who entered, moving with hesitant steps of someone unsure of his welcome. I saw the lights, he said. I wanted to make sure everything was okay. Everything's fine, Emma said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Sarah gathered her purse and coat. I should head home. Early morning tomorrow, I need to start making phone calls about the school situation. She paused at the door. Emma, think about what we discussed. All of it. After Sarah left, Emma found herself alone with Jake for the second time in 2 days. The diner felt different at night, more intimate, heavy with the weight of shared memories and unspoken possibilities. How are you holding up? Jake asked, sliding into the booth Sarah had vacated. Honestly, I'm not sure. This morning I was an architect from Denver helping with a grant application. Tonight I feel like I'm in the middle of some kind of small-town civil war. Jake's smile was rueful. Welcome to Millbrook politics. Everything's personal here, and every decision affects 3 generations of family history, including your family's resort project. Jake's expression grew serious. Especially that. Emma leaned forward, studying his face in the warm light of the diner. Jake, can I ask you something directly? Sure. Do you support your father's development plans? For a long moment, Jake didn't answer. He stared out the window at the darkening street, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup Emma had automatically refilled. My father believes that growth is the only alternative to death. that places like Millbrook either evolve or disappear. Jake's voice was carefully neutral. He's not wrong about the economics. That's not what I asked. Jake met her eyes. No, it's not. So what do you believe? I believe, Jake paused, seeming to choose his words with infinite care. I believe that some things are worth preserving even if they're not profitable. I believe that communities matter more than commerce. And I believe that once you turn a place like this into a theme park for rich tourists, you can never get back what you've lost. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Emma felt something shift in her understanding of Jake Morrison, not just the man he'd become, but the choices he was facing. That must put you in a difficult position with your family. You could say that. Jake's smile was bitter. My father has made it clear that supporting the resort project is a condition of my inheritance. Not just the ranch, but my place in the family business, my role in the community, everything. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. And if you don't support it, then I'm on my own, which might not be such a bad thing, except Jake's voice trailed off. Except what? Except that I'm not the only one who would suffer. There are people depending on me, responsibilities I can't just walk away from. Emma found herself wanting to reach across the table to offer some kind of comfort for burdens she didn't fully understand. But the gesture felt too intimate, too presumptuous for whatever fragile détente they'd established. Jake, she said quietly, what happened to you? Really, Sarah mentioned Afghanistan, but there's more to it than that. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Jake stared into his coffee cup as if it contained secrets he wasn't ready to share. I lost people, he said finally. Good people who trusted me to bring them home. And when I came back here, I realized that all the things I'd thought mattered, family legacy, social position, business, a success, none of it meant anything compared to the people who didn't make it back. The rawness in his voice made Emma's chest tighten. She'd spent so many years thinking of Jake Morrison as the golden boy of Millbrook, the heir to everything she'd never been allowed to claim. She'd never considered that privilege might come with its own kind of prison. I'm sorry, she said and meant it. Don't be a. It's not your burden to carry. Jake stood reaching for his wallet. I should let you get some rest. Jake, Emma's voice stopped him at the door. For what it's worth, I think the people who didn't make it back would want you to fight for the things that matter. He turned back to her, something unreadable flickering across his features. Even if it means fighting my own family. Especially then. Jake nodded slowly as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. Good night, Emma. Thank you for the coffee. After he left, Emma sat alone in the diner, surrounded by the ghosts of 40 years of community life. Through the window, she could see the lights of Millbrook beginning to wink out as the town settled into sleep. For the first time since returning, Emma found herself wondering if she was exactly where she needed to be. The next morning brought crisp air and the first dusting of snow on the mountain peaks. Emma arrived at the diner early, determined to establish some kind of routine that might help her navigate the increasingly complex dynamics of small-town life. The breakfast crowd was becoming familiar. Bill Watson with his black coffee and over-easy eggs, Mrs. Henderson from the post office, with her weekly gossip update, a handful of ranchers discussing cattle prices and weather predictions. But the conversation stopped when Martha Morrison entered at 8:30, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from comfortable to cautious. Good morning, Miss Reid. Martha's smile was perfectly polite and completely cold. I wondered if we might have a word. Emma wiped her hands on her apron, acutely aware that every customer in the diner was listening, despite their pretense of eating breakfast. Of course, coffee. Please. They settled at the corner booth, the same spot where Emma had sat with Jake the previous evening. Martha Morrison arranged herself with the careful precision of someone who understood the power of presentation. I'll come straight to the point, Martha said. I'm concerned about the influence you might have on my son. Emma nearly choked on her coffee. I'm sorry. Jacob has always been impressionable, idealistic. His military service intensified these tendencies. Martha's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow student. He's at a crucial juncture in his life, and I'd hate to see him make decisions based on romantic notions rather than practical considerations. Mrs. Morrison, I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, dear. I'm stating directly that Jacob's future depends on his ability to embrace family responsibilities rather than chasing childhood fantasies. Martha leaned forward slightly. You represent a particular kind of fantasy for him, one that could prove very costly. Emma felt heat rising in her cheeks. The careful politeness barely concealed the threat beneath Martha's words. With respect, Mrs. Morrison, your son is a grown man. His decisions are his own to make. Are they? Martha's smile sharpened. How interesting that you should mention decisions. I understand you have been offered an opportunity to work on our resort project. A significant career opportunity, I'm told. The implication was clear. Choose the Morrison family business or face the consequences. Emma had encountered similar power plays in Denver's business world, but never with such personal stakes attached. I haven't made any decisions about that project. Of course not. You're a careful person. I can see that. You understand the value of considering all factors before making important choices. Martha stood, leaving a $20 bill on the table despite having barely touched her coffee. I do hope you'll think carefully about what's best for everyone involved, including Jacob. After Martha left, the diner slowly returned to its normal rhythm. But Emma felt shaken by the encounter, unsettled by the realization that her presence in Millbrook was creating ripples she hadn't anticipated. Around noon, Sarah appeared with red eyes and the exhausted expression of someone who'd spent the morning fighting losing battles. How did the phone calls go? Emma asked, though Sarah's expression already provided the answer. About as well as expected. The state won't intervene in local school board decisions. The parent organization doesn't have enough members to mount effective opposition, and 3 families have already started making plans to move to towns with better schools. Emma poured Sarah coffee without being asked. I'm sorry. It's not your fault, it's just… Sarah's voice cracked slightly. This place is dying, Emma. Slowly, quietly, but definitely dying. The school closure is just the final nail in the coffin. Maybe not. What do you mean? Emma had been thinking about it all morning, ever since Martha Morrison's veiled threats had crystallized her understanding of what was really at stake in Millbrook. What if we bypassed the grant applications entirely, found private funding for the school renovation? Sarah stared at her. Private funding, Emma, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. I know, but there are people who care about this community, right? People with resources who might be willing to invest in its future. In theory, yes, but the only person in Millbrook with that kind of money is Tom Morrison, and he's the one pushing for consolidation. Emma thought about the resort plans, the carefully calculated development that would transform the valley into something unrecognizable. Then she thought about Jake's quiet anguish, his talk of fights worth having, even when you couldn't win them. What about Jake? She said quietly. Jake doesn't have independent access to family money. Everything goes through Tom. Sarah paused, studying Emma's face. Why, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that maybe it's time to find out what Jake Morrison is really willing to fight for. That evening, Emma closed the diner early and drove out to Morrison Ranch. She'd never been to the family's main house, but everyone in Millbrook knew where it was, a sprawling log and stone structure set on a rise overlooking the valley, designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Jake answered the door himself, surprise flickering across his features when he saw her. Emma, is everything okay? I need to talk to you privately. He glanced back toward the house where Emma could hear the murmur of voices from what sounded like a dinner party in progress. Let's walk, Jake said, grabbing a jacket from beside the door. They followed a gravel path toward the barn, their footsteps crunching in the cold air. Above them, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and the mountains loomed like sleeping giants against the horizon. What's on your mind? Jake asked when they were safely away from the house. Emma had rehearsed this conversation during the drive, but now standing in the shadow of Morrison wealth and power, her planned words seemed inadequate. The school, she said finally. Sarah's running out of options. I know, I've been following the situation. Following it or doing something about it? Jake stopped walking, turning to face her. In the dim light from the barn, his expression was unreadable. What exactly are you asking me, Emma? I'm asking if you're willing to put your money where your mouth is. You said some fights are worth having, even if you can't win them. Well, here's your fight. And what would you have me do? Openly defy my father, challenge the family business that employs half this town. I'm suggesting you might have more options than you think. Emma pulled out her phone showing Jake the preliminary renovation plans she'd been working on throughout the day. These are rough estimates, but I think we could restore the school for about $400,000. Half the cost of your father's consultant projections and twice as effective. Jake studied the plans with professional interest. This is impressive work. But Emma, even if I had that kind of money, you do have it, or you will when you turn 30. Jake's head snapped up. How do you know about my trust fund? Your grandmother's will was public record when she died 5 years ago. Sarah mentioned it when we were talking about potential donors. Emma took a breath. $1 million available when you reach your 30th birthday, which is in 6 weeks. They stared at each other in the gathering darkness. Emma could hear the distant sound of cattle and the whisper of wind through the aspens. Somewhere in the main house, laughter echoed from the dinner party, the sound of people whose biggest worry was choosing the right wine with dinner. You're asking me to risk everything, Jake said quietly. I'm asking you to decide what everything means to you. And if I say yes, if I fund the school renovation against my father's wishes, what then? Emma felt her heart beating faster. Then we find out what you're really made of. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the renovation plans to Emma's face and back again. There's something you should know, he said finally, about why your grandmother mentioned my name before she died. Emma's pulse quickened. What? She made me promise something. The last time we talked about 3 weeks before she passed, she made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd look after you when you came back. Look after me. Her exact words were, that girl is going to need someone who understands what it costs to choose principle over profit. Someone who knows that some things are worth more than money. Jake's voice was soft. I think she knew this moment would come. The school crisis, the resort development, and all of it. Emma felt tears pricking her eyes. Even in death, Reid had been orchestrating connections, building bridges across the divides that had shaped Millbrook for generations. So what's your answer? She whispered. Jake looked back toward the main house where his family's dinner party continued in warmth and luxury. Then he turned to face the valley below where the lights of Millbrook twinkled like fallen stars. My answer, he said slowly, is that it's time I started honoring the promises I've made. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found what he was looking for. Morrison Ranch, Jake speaking. Yes, I need to schedule a meeting with the trust administrators. Tomorrow morning if possible. Yes, I understand the implications. When he hung up, Emma felt something fundamental shift between them. They were no longer the children who had hurt each other out of ignorance and insecurity. They were adults standing at the crossroads of their own making, choosing to fight for something bigger than themselves. Thank you, Emma said. Don't thank me yet. This is going to get ugly before it gets better. I know. My family is going to hate you, and me. I know that too. Well, Jake smiled then, the first genuinely happy expression Emma had seen from him since returning to Millbrook. You know what, I think I'm okay with that. As they walked back toward the house, Emma realized that everything had changed. The girl who had left Millbrook 10 years ago, running from rejection and disappointment, was gone. In her place stood a woman who was finally ready to fight for the things that mattered. And for the first time since Margaret's death, Emma felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The meeting with the trust administrators took place in the conference room of Millbrook's only law firm, a converted Victorian house that had served the community's legal needs for over a century. Emma waited outside in her car, watching through the lace-curtained windows as Jake sat across from two men in expensive suits who had driven up from Billings. She didn't need to hear the conversation to understand its gravity. Jake's posture, ramrod straight, hands clasped on the table, spoke of someone making irrevocable decisions. When he emerged an hour later, his face was pale but determined. It's done, he said, sliding into the passenger seat of Emma's rental car. The funds will be available Monday morning. Emma felt her heart skip. And your family? Don't know yet. The administrators are required to notify the trustee of any major withdrawals, but that won't happen until after the transfer is complete. Jake's smile was grim. We'll have about 48 hours before all hell breaks loose. They drove through town in contemplative silence, past the boarded-up storefronts in the school that would soon be saved or lost forever. Emma found herself memorizing details, the way autumn light slanted through the aspens, the comfortable shabbiness of buildings that had sheltered generations, the sense that time moved differently here. Jake, she said as they pulled up to the diner, are you sure about this? No, but I'm sure about what happens if we don't try. That evening, Sarah arrived at the diner with a bottle of champagne and tears in her eyes. Word had somehow leaked about Jake's decision, and the phone had been ringing all afternoon with calls from parents, teachers, and community members who had thought the school fight was over. I can't believe it, Sarah said for the fourth time. $400,000, just like that. It's not just like that, Emma corrected. Jake is risking everything he has ever known for this, which makes it even more incredible. Sarah poured champagne into coffee cups, the closest thing to wine glasses the diner could provide, to Jake Morrison, who turned out to be nothing like we expected. They were interrupted by the sound of vehicles pulling up outside. Through the windows, Emma could see two black SUVs and a pickup truck arranged in what looked suspiciously like a formation designed to prevent easy escape. Company, she murmured. Tom Morrison entered first, followed by Martha and two men Emma didn't recognize, but who carried themselves with the authority of lawyers or accountants. The small diner suddenly felt crowded, charged with the electricity of confrontation. Miss Reid, Mrs. Mitchell. Tom's voice was coldly polite. I wonder if we might have a word. Sarah started to stand. I should go. Actually, Martha said you should stay. This concerns the school situation, which I believe involves you directly. Emma felt the familiar stirring of defiance. What can we do for you, Mr. Morrison? You can explain to me why my son has decided to throw away his inheritance on a lost cause. Tom's composure was slipping, revealing the anger beneath his controlled exterior. $400,000 to renovate a building that should have been condemned years ago. Maybe you should ask Jake that question. Oh, I intend to, but first I wanted to understand the source of his inspiration. Tom's gaze moved between Emma and Sarah. It seems my son has developed some interesting new perspectives since certain people returned to town. Emma felt her temper rising. Your son is a grown man making his own decisions. My son is a confused veteran being manipulated by people who don't understand the consequences of their actions. Martha stepped forward, her voice sharp with accusation. Do you have any idea what you've done, the damage you've caused to this family? The only damage I see, Sarah interjected quietly, is what happens when people care more about control than community. The room fell silent except for the hum of the coffee machine and the distant sound of wind through the bare trees outside. Emma could feel the weight of decades of small-town politics, family loyalty, and economic pressure pressing down on all of them. Mr. Morrison, Emma said carefully, I understand you're upset, but Jake made this decision because he believes the school matters more than your resort development. Maybe the question you should be asking is why he felt he had to choose between them. There was no choice to make, Tom replied. The school closure is an economic necessity. The resort development represents Millbrook's future. Jacob's trust fund was supposed to be his stake in that future. And now, Tom's smile was cold, now he'll have to live with the consequences of choosing principle over prosperity. One of the men Emma didn't recognize stepped forward, extending a thick envelope. Miss Reid, my name is David Patterson. I represent Morrison Development Group. We'd like to make you an offer. Emma stared at the envelope without taking it. What kind of offer? Chief architect for the Morrison Mountain Resort project, full creative control, significant compensation, and a partnership track that could make you one of the most successful architects in the region. Patterson's voice carried the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to closing deals. The contract is generous enough to make any reasonable person very happy. And if I'm not interested, then you'll find that small-town businesses can be fragile. Permits can be delayed, and inspections can be particularly thorough. Suppliers can become unreliable. Tom's threat was delivered with the same polite tone he might use to discuss the weather. It would be unfortunate if Reid's family diner couldn't remain viable during your stay in Millbrook. Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't just about the school or the resort anymore. This was about power control and the price of defying the Morrison family's vision for their domain. You're threatening me. I'm offering you an opportunity to be part of something bigger than a failing diner in a dying town. Tom's voice hardened. What you do with that opportunity is entirely up to you. Sarah stood abruptly. I think you should leave. Mrs. Mitchell, you do well to remember that the school district receives significant annual donations from Morrison Ranch. Donations that could easily be redirected to more cooperative communities. Martha's smile was razor sharp. I'd hate to see you lose your teaching position over poor judgment. Get out. Emma's voice was quiet but steady. All of you, get out of my grandmother's diner. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Tom Morrison straightened his coat and nodded to his companions. You have 48 hours to reconsider our offer, Miss Reid. After that, the terms become significantly less generous. He paused at the door. And Miss Reid, would you speak to my son, please remind him that some bridges once burned cannot be rebuilt. After they left, Emma and Sarah sat in shaken silence. The cheerful atmosphere of their celebration had evaporated, replaced by the sobering reality of what they were up against. Jesus, Sarah whispered. I knew Tom Morrison was ruthless, but that was a declaration of war. Emma's hands were trembling as she poured herself more champagne. And we just became enemy combatants. Jake arrived an hour later, his face grim with the news of his own confrontation with family authority. He'd been officially disinherited, banned from ranch property, and informed that his position as heir apparent had been terminated with extreme prejudice. I'm sorry, Emma said as he slumped into the booth beside her. Don't be. I knew this was coming the moment I made the call to the trust administrators. Jake accepted the coffee she offered, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. The only surprise is how quickly they moved to make it official. What will you do now? I'm not sure. I've got some money saved, and the trust fund is still mine regardless of family opinion. But beyond that, Jake shrugged. I guess I'll figure it out as I go. Sarah leaned across the table. Jake, you don't understand what you've done, not just for the school, but for this whole community. People are talking about fighting back, organizing, standing up to your father's development plans. That's good. That's what should happen. But it's dangerous. Your family won't just roll over and accept defeat. They'll fight dirty. Jake's smile was bitter. Trust me, I know exactly how dirty the Morrison family can fight. I've been on the receiving end of it my whole life. Emma studied his profile in the warm light of the diner. What was it like growing up with all that pressure? Like being groomed for a job you never wanted but couldn't refuse. Every decision evaluated for its impact on family reputation, every relationship analyzed for its political implications. Jake paused. Do you know why I really joined the Army? To get away? To find out who I was when nobody was watching. To see if Jacob Morrison existed separate from Morrison Ranch and Morrison money and Morrison expectations. His voice grew quiet. Turns out he does. But it took losing friends in Afghanistan to figure out what really mattered. They sat in contemplative silence, three people who had found themselves at the center of a conflict they hadn't chosen but couldn't avoid. Outside, Millbrook settled into its evening routine, unaware that its future was being decided in a small diner by people who cared more about community than profit. Emma, Jake said suddenly, there's something else you should know. About your grandmother's will. Emma's pulse quickened. What about it? The 6-month residency requirement wasn't just legal formality. Margaret specifically requested it, even though it complicated the estate transfer. Jake met her eyes. She wanted to make sure you'd be here long enough to understand what you'd be giving up if you left again. Giving up. This place, these people, the chance to be part of something real instead of just successful. Emma felt tears burning her eyes. Even in death, Margaret Reid was still teaching, still guiding, still believing that her granddaughter could choose love over ambition. She knew, didn't she? About your family's plans, about the school closure, about everything. Margaret Reid knew this town better than anyone alive. She saw the patterns, understood, the politics, recognized the moment when everything would come to a head. Jake's voice was soft with admiration, and she made sure you'd be here when it happened. Sarah wiped her eyes with a diner napkin. So what do we do now? The school renovation can move forward, but your father isn't going to just accept defeat gracefully. We build something they can't tear down, Emma said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. We show this community that there's another way forward, one that doesn't require selling our souls to developers. Jake looked at her intently. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about what you said, about fights being worth having, even if you can't win them. Emma pulled out her phone, scrolling to the architectural plans she'd been refining all week. What if we didn't just save the school? What if we saved the whole downtown? She showed them the design she'd been working on, adaptive reuse projects that could transform empty storefronts and into vibrant community spaces. Historical preservation initiatives that would attract tourism without destroying local character. Sustainable development principles that could serve as a model for rural communities throughout the region. This is incredible, Sarah breathed. But Emma, the funding alone would be millions of dollars. Not if we're smart about it. Historical preservation grants state tourism development funds, federal rural development programs. There's money out there for projects like this, but it requires someone who knows how to navigate the application process. Someone like you. Someone exactly like me. Emma felt the familiar excitement of a vision taking shape. Jake, your trust fund could be seed money for a community development corporation. Sarah, your connections in education could help us access federal programs designed to support rural schools. Jake was studying the plans with growing interest. This could work. It would take time and it would require community buy-in, but it could actually work. More than that, Emma said. It could prove that small towns don't have to choose between survival and soul. They can have both if they're willing to fight for it. Sarah raised her coffee cup in a mock toast to fighting for both. But as they clinked cups and made plans, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Tom Morrison's threats had been more than just bluster. The Morrison family had controlled Millbrook for 3 generations, and they wouldn't surrender that control without a fight. The real battle was just beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, Emma threw herself into the school renovation project with an intensity that surprised everyone, including herself. She worked 18-hour days coordinating contractors, finalizing permits, and managing the dozen small crises that arose when trying to restore an 80-year-old building on a tight timeline. But more than that, she found herself falling in love with the work in a way she'd never experienced in Denver. This wasn't about impressing clients or building her reputation. This was about creating something that would matter to real people for generations to come. Jake proved to be an invaluable partner, his practical knowledge of construction and local suppliers complementing Emma's design expertise. They worked side by side, covered in dust and paint, sharing late-night dinners at the diner while reviewing the next day's priorities. Slowly, Emma began to understand that this was what collaboration was supposed to feel like, not the careful maneuvering of professional relationships, but the easy rhythm of 2 people united by common purpose. You know, Jake said one evening as they sat in the school's nearly finished library, I never imagined my trust fund would be spent on something like this. Regrets? The opposite. For the first time in my life, I feel like my money is doing something meaningful. Emma looked around the transformed space, bright, warm, designed to inspire learning and creativity in children who might otherwise have been bused to a generic classroom 30 miles away. Jake, can I ask you something personal? Shoot. What did you want to be when you were a kid before all the expectations and family pressure? Jake was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving across the shelves they'd spent the afternoon installing. A teacher, he said finally. I wanted to be a teacher. What subject? History. I love the stories, the way everything connected across time. I used to imagine standing in front of a classroom, helping kids understand that they were part of something bigger than themselves. Emma felt her heart clench. What happened to that dream? Morrison men don't become teachers. We become leaders, entrepreneurs, pillars of the community. Jake's smile was rueful. My father made it clear that teaching was a nice hobby for people who couldn't handle real responsibility. And you believed him. I was 18 and desperate for approval. Of course I believed him. They sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the fruits of their labor and the ghosts of dreams deferred. Emma found herself imagining Jake in front of a classroom, his natural thoughtfulness and hard-won wisdom guiding young minds toward understanding. It's not too late, she said quietly. What do you mean, to teach? To be who you wanted to be before the world told you who you had to become. Jake looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Emma, I'm 29 years old. I have no education degree, no classroom experience, no idea how to even start over at this point in my life. But you have something more valuable than any of that, which is you have the courage to choose principle over profit. You have the wisdom that comes from genuine struggle. And you have the kind of heart that drives someone to spend $400,000 saving a school for other people's children. Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Do you really think it's possible to start over completely? I think it's the only way any of us survive. We start over again and again until we become who we're supposed to be. That night, as Emma drove back to the diner through the early November darkness, she found herself thinking about starting over. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a successful architect with a clear career trajectory and a carefully ordered life in Denver. Now she was living above a small-town diner fighting political battles she'd never chosen and falling in love with a man she'd spent her childhood hating. The realization hit her like a physical blow, causing her to pull over to the side of the road. She was falling in love with Jake Morrison. Not the boy who had represented everything she'd felt excluded from, but the man who had risked everything to save something that mattered. The man who spoke with careful consideration, who carried his burdens with quiet dignity, who had chosen community over comfort. Emma sat in her car, engine running, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening to her. Love had always been something she approached cautiously, analytically, with careful consideration of compatibility and long-term prospects. This was different. This was the kind of love that changed everything, messy, inconvenient, transformative, in ways that couldn't be planned or controlled, and it terrified her. The grand reopening of Millbrook Elementary was scheduled for the day before Thanksgiving, a symbolic gesture that felt appropriate for a community celebrating something worth being grateful for. Emma had worked with Sarah to plan a community celebration tours of the renovated building, speeches from local leaders, and a potluck dinner in the newly restored gymnasium. But the morning of the celebration brought news that cast a shadow over the festivities. Tom Morrison had filed an injunction against the school district, claiming that the renovation work had been completed without proper environmental impact studies. The legal challenge wouldn't stop the celebration, but it could force the school to close again while the courts sorted through months of bureaucratic review. "It's harassment, pure and simple," Sarah said, as she paced the length of the diner's main room. "The environmental studies were completed 6 months ago. Tom Morrison is just trying to delay the reopening until he can find another way to force consolidation." Emma felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest. Can he do that legally, I mean? Unfortunately, yes. Montana environmental law gives citizens broad rights to challenge development projects, even when those challenges are clearly frivolous. Jake appeared in the doorway, snow-dusting his jacket and something dark in his expression. "There's more," he said without preamble. "My father has also filed a claim against my trust fund, arguing that I'm mentally incompetent to manage such a large sum of money." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. "What does that mean?" "It means that if he's successful, the court could freeze my assets and appoint a conservator to manage my financial affairs. Someone chosen by the family, of course." Sarah sank into the nearest booth. Jesus, how is that even possible? Family money comes with family strings. The trust documents include provisions for mental health evaluations if there are concerns about the beneficiary's judgment. Jake's smile was bitter. Apparently, funding a school renovation against family wishes qualifies as evidence of impaired judgment. Emma stood abruptly, fury giving her energy she didn't know she possessed. "That's insane. You're not mentally incompetent. You're making principled decisions about your own money. Try explaining that to a judge who's played golf with Tom Morrison for 20 years. Then we fight it. We get our own lawyer, our own expert witnesses. We prove that you're perfectly capable of making your own financial decisions." "With what money?" "My assets are frozen pending the competency evaluation." Emma felt the walls closing in around them. Every move they made, every small victory they achieved was being systematically undermined by the Morrison family's wealth and influence. But as she looked around the diner at the photos of Margaret Reid serving 3 generations of Millbrook residents, at the worn booths where countless important conversations had taken place, at the evidence of a life spent in service to community, Emma felt her grandmother's spirit reminding her that some fights were bigger than the people fighting them. "Jake," she said quietly, "how much do you trust me?" "With my life." "Why?" "Because I think it's time we played by Morrison rules instead of trying to be honorable people in a dishonorable game." Sarah looked up sharply. "What are you thinking?" Emma pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts until she found the number she was looking for. "I'm thinking that Tom Morrison isn't the only one who can call in favors from old friends." She dialed, waiting through several rings before a familiar voice answered. Morrison Development Group, this is David Patterson. Mr. Patterson, this is Emma Reid. I'm calling to accept your offer. Jake and Sarah stared at her in shock, but Emma held up a hand silencing their protests. Excellent news, Miss Reid. When can we schedule a contract signing? Tomorrow morning, but I have some conditions. I'm listening. First, I want creative control over all aspects of the resort design, including the authority to modify or reject any element that doesn't meet my professional standards. That's unusual but potentially acceptable. Second, I want a performance clause that protects my position if the project faces any legal challenges or permit delays. Again, unusual, but we can work with that. And third, Emma said, meeting Jake's eyes across the diner, I want a community liaison position created for the project. Someone to ensure that local interests are represented throughout the development process. May I ask who you have in mind for this position? Jake Morrison. The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Emma could almost hear Patterson calculating the political implications of employing the prodigal son who had just defied family authority. Miss Reid, I'm not sure that would be appropriate given the recent family complications. Mr. Patterson, are you offering me this job because of my professional qualifications or because you want to neutralize opposition to your project? Another pause. Your professional qualifications, of course. Then you'll understand that I require team members I can trust completely. Jake Morrison has proven himself to be a man of integrity and principle. Those are exactly the qualities I need in a community liaison. I'll need to discuss this with my clients. Of course, let me know by tomorrow morning. Otherwise, I'll assume the offer has been withdrawn and make other arrangements. Emma hung up, aware that Jake and Sarah were staring at her as if she'd lost her mind. Emma, Jake said carefully, what the hell are you doing? I'm getting you a job, legal standing to challenge your father's competency claim, and access to the inside of the resort development project. Emma's smile was sharp. I'm also buying us time to figure out how to destroy it from within. Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to admiration. You're going to sabotage the project. I'm going to design the most expensive, most environmentally sensitive, most community-focused resort in Montana history. I'm going to make it so expensive and so complicated that Morrison Development Group will beg me to find a less ambitious alternative. Jake started to laugh, the first genuinely happy sound Emma had heard from him in weeks. You're going to make them pay you to kill their own project. Exactly. And by the time they figure out what's happening, we'll have documented evidence of every environmental corner. They wanted to cut every community concern. They wanted to ignore every regulation they were planning to circumvent. Emma felt the familiar rush of a plan coming together, the satisfaction of turning her opponent's strength against them. Margaret Reid would be proud, Sarah said softly. Margaret Reid is probably laughing her ass off in whatever comes after this, Emma replied. She always said the best revenge was living well, but sometimes the best revenge is making your enemies pay for the privilege of watching you succeed. As the three of them sat in the warm light of the diner planning their next moves in a game that had suddenly become winnable, Emma realized that she was exactly where she belonged. Not because Millbrook was perfect, and not because the fight would be easy, but because this was where her heart had led her, and her heart had finally learned the difference between running away and standing still long enough to build something worth keeping. Outside, snow was beginning to fall in earnest, covering the valley in the kind of pristine white that made everything look possible again. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, for the first time in weeks, Emma Reid felt like she was home.